I'm actually going to pick three big issues of the day: climate, oil dependence, and nuclear proliferation, and suggest how they can all be resolved at a profit, and much more easily than you might suppose, and with less public policy than you might suppose, all in the spirit of Raymond Williams' remark that to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. We are often offered in the media a really stupid multiple choice test. Would you prefer to die of climate change, or oil wars, or nuclear holocaust? Of course, a better answer, which we are seldom offered, is none of the above, because all three of these problems go away if we just use energy in a way that saves money, and most people of whatever ideological persuasion are interested in saving or making money. So let me start with climate. Do any of you happen to know how climate protection is like the Hubble Space Telescope? No? Oh, well, they were both messed up by a sign error, a confusion between a plus and a minus sign. That's what caused the mirror to be ground in the wrong shape. And the same error permeates the public discourse on climate, which is all about cost, burden, and sacrifice. And the only argument is how much is the cost of protecting the climate and who's going to pay for it. Actually, the economic theorists got the sign wrong. Climate protection is a highly profitable activity basically because it's cheaper to save fuel than to buy fuel. Efficiency is cheaper than fuel. Therefore, the discussion should be about profits, jobs, and competitive advantage. And as soon as that reframing occurs, any remaining resistance will melt faster than the glacier. The biggest obstacle to protecting the climate is the unexamined and simply false assumption that it will be costly. And a lot of companies are starting to understand this. In fact, our colleagues at McKinsey have put out a very interesting study saying that about 46% of the projected greenhouse gas emissions of the world in 2030 can be abated at an average cost of just €2 per ton of CO2 equivalent, which is practically free. And it's a very technically conservative study. I think the actual cost will be a good deal less and the quantity larger when they get into the next layer of technology and design integration. And smart companies are figuring this out. So, for example, two of our biggest chip makers have been cutting their carbon emissions 6% a year with 2 or 3 year paybacks from fixing up their plants. DuPont raised some eyebrows by saying in 2010, through 6% a year energy savings and some shift to renewables, they will have cut greenhouse gas emissions to 65% less than they were in 1990. That sounds awfully ambitious. How are they doing? Well, by a couple of years ago, they were actually 80% below 1990, and they'd made $3 billion by substituting efficiency for energy. Dow made even more money on its energy productivity investments. BP met its operational carbon reduction goal 8 years early at a $2 billion profit. GE, with its well-known sharp pencil, has pledged a 30% energy efficiency gain by 2012 to build shareholder value, and they're well along with that. Interface, carpet company, run by Ray Anderson, already cut its greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms by 60%, and in the carpet business 80%, while growing the business and building the strongest cost structure in the industry and the most oil-resistant one. It's serving them very well now, as you can imagine. Well, so 60% cut was 9% a year. Texas Instruments built a new chip fab in Texas, not China, because while saving a good deal of energy and water, we were able to cut out $230 million of capital cost, saving 1,000 high-tech jobs. And there are many stories like this. Basically, while the politicians keep debating theoretical costs and their allocation, smart companies are racing for the profits before their rivals get there. Now, reduced energy per dollar of GDP has already done remarkable things. Over about 30 years, we've cut the energy intensity 48% per dollar, oil 54%, directly used gas almost 2/3, electricity 1/6, water 2/3. Nobody noticed. And by the way, we did this despite having stagnant light vehicle efficiency for over 2 decades, and despite in 48 states rewarding utilities for selling you more energy and penalizing them for cutting your bill, which is just as dumb as it sounds. And we haven't really paid attention since the mid-'80s, so imagine if we actually fixed those 2 big problems and paid attention. On the other hand, technology keeps improving for wringing more work out of our energy, and if we fully used what we've got now, we could get the same or better hot showers, cold beer, mobility, comfort, and other services, saving half the oil at what's now 1/7 of its price, half the gas at 1/8 of its price, and at least 3/4 of the electricity at 1/8 of its price. So by paying only 1/6 as much to save the energy as we would have paid at today's prices to buy it, we could achieve those savings over several decades. And by the way, that would lower the prices and make them a lot less volatile. To do this, by the way, requires a lot of barrier busting, attention to the 60 or 80 obstacles to buying all this efficiency and turning each one into a business opportunity. We laid out a decade ago how to do that, and that's what some of the smart companies I mentioned are doing. Now, economic theorists normally assume that energy intensity in the world will continue to drift down by 1% a year, but that's not enough to offset population and economic growth. Therefore, carbon emissions would triple by 2100. In that scenario, we'd be toast. On the other hand, if you could make energy intensity go down 2% a year, that would be enough to offset population and economic growth on normal projections. So carbon emissions would flatten out, and if you could cut energy intensity 3% a year, carbon emissions would go down and fairly promptly stabilize climate to the extent that irreversible changes are not already underway. Can we imagine cutting the world's energy intensity 3% a year? Well, yeah. Actually, the U.S. normally does around that or better. We did 4% in 2006. California is normally a percentage point faster than the rest of the country, has already quadrupled the efficiency of its new houses and is just getting started. China did better. They've cut energy intensity over 5% a year for a quarter century, came off the rails 7 years ago and are back on the rails roughly last year, and energy efficiency is their top priority. And attentive companies, some of which I've or named, have profitably cut their energy intensity or even their absolute usage 6 to 9% a year. So why should 3% a year be hard? And since everybody makes money on it, why should it be costly? Even Japan, which uses half to a third the energy per dollar that we do, is coming up with ways to triple its energy efficiency profitably. By the way, Japan has 1/7 the energy intensity of China, so if you think that economic structures converge over the long run, you could make an argument that China could have, say, a 20 times bigger economy by, I don't know, 2050 or so than now, and still use a bit less energy than now and make money on it. Now, I want to tell 2 stories about cutting energy intensity and displacing carbon, and those are the oil and electricity stories, each of which accounts for about 2/5 of our fossil fuel CO2 emissions. Let me start with oil. Some of you may know a book, independent study we did mainly for the Pentagon, released in September '04. Nobody's arguing with it. It's introduced by George Shultz and Sir Mark Moody Stewart, the former Shell chairman. And it's written for business and military leaders, not for politicians. They can hear about it later from their constituents. It's built around competitive strategy business cases for cars, trucks, planes, fuels, and military. And you can get it all free at oilendgame.com with all its backup, with every calc and document laid out. And it's simply a roadmap for getting the United States completely off oil, not just imports, but all oil by the 2040s, led by business for profit and with a much stronger economy. The roadmap could lead to this kind of result. The use and imports of oil, instead of heading steeply toward the northeast corner as officially forecast, could turn down along the green curves if we redoubled the efficiency of using oil at an average cost of $12 a barrel, year $2,000, and could turn down even more steeply along the blue curves if we replace the other half of the oil with a mixture that's roughly 3/5 saved natural gas and 2/5 advanced biofuel, mainly cellulosic ethanol. And because saving half our gas turns out to cost about 1/8 what we pay for gas, and most of the savings are actually negative cost, the average cost of that supply substitution is $18 a barrel. So if you average 12 and 18, you end up with a $15 a barrel cost for getting completely off oil. And that's a whole lot cheaper than 100 and some to buy the stuff. We're assuming here, of course, that all externalities, climate change, security, whatever, are worth zero, a conservatively low estimate. Now, we've done this sort of thing before. Look back here where there was an even steeper drop in oil use and oil imports. That was the last time we paid attention to oil, 1977 to 85. In those 8 years, the economy grew 27%, while oil use went down 17%. Oil imports fell 50%. Oil imports from the Persian Gulf fell 87% in 8 years, and they would have been gone in one more year if we'd kept that up. In fact, OPEC's exports were cut by half, and it broke their pricing power for a decade because we customers, especially America, the Saudi Arabia of negabarrels, turned out to have more market power than the supply cartel did because we could save oil faster than they could conveniently sell less oil. That is all the more true now, especially given the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed. And we could rerun that old play all over again a whole lot better with today's better technologies. But that was practice. This is real. You are here. Now, suppose that from now on we invested $180 billion once, half of it to retool the car, truck, and plane industries, half to build an advanced biofuels industry. And suppose that by 2025 this had been so successful that it crashed the oil price back to the official forecast at the time when we wrote this, namely $26 a barrel, which is actually possible. In that case, against $26 oil, that $180 billion investment would yield a gross return of $155 billion a year, a net return, very handsome, of $70 billion a year. As a free byproduct, we would cut carbon emissions by a quarter. We would get about 1 million new jobs, 3/4 of them in rural and small town America, and we would get to save 1 million jobs, mainly in automaking, that are now at risk, because we don't seem to have decided yet whether we're going to continue importing efficient cars to replace oil or to make efficient cars and import neither the oil nor the cars, which somehow sounds smarter. Now, the spread between the $15 a barrel average cost of getting off oil and the price of the oil we save or displace is very juicy. That spread is what motivates business to do what I've described. And the business case is so compelling that we found that this transition could be achieved in the U.S. without new energy taxes, subsidies, mandates, federal laws, or anything else that either party doesn't like or could mess up. We do not need to go to the great sausage factory across town for anything on this. There are some public policies that would make it happen better with higher confidence, with less risk, by supporting and not distorting the business logic, but those can all be done administratively or at a state level. So when I pre-briefed this before publication on the Hill, both parties, both houses, the most senior Republican then in power, after a long pause said, you know, I'm really glad you're not coming up here to ask us to do something because we would just screw it up. Well, okay. Now, technologically, the key is to triple the efficiency of cars, trucks, and planes, because transport uses 70% of the oil. The other 30% goes to buildings and industry, where there's also a lot of great stuff to do to save oil. But tripling the efficiency of cars, trucks, and planes has a respective payback at prices a bit lower than now of 2 years, 1 year, and 4 or 5 years using a common technological recipe. Namely, you make the vehicles lighter weight or slippery in moving through the air along the road, and you give them advanced propulsion like hybrids. Often with better performance and with very nice economics. So the tripled efficiency cars with all the same attributes except better safety actually would be equivalent to buying gasoline at the pump for 57 cents a gallon, diesel for your truck at 25 cents a gallon, Jet A for your plane at 46 cents a gallon. Real cheap. And the better performance is illustrated by this diesel carbon fiber hybrid from Opel, concept car, gets 155 miles an hour. It also can do 94 miles a gallon, although not at the same instant. And the analytic surprise to many is that the ultralighting that doubles the efficiency of these carbon fiber concept cars would in volume production be free. It would not increase the cost to make the cars because the costlier materials would be paid for by simpler automaking and a 2 or 3 times smaller propulsion system. More on that in a minute. Now, to understand how this magic happens, just think about the physics of your car. Your car every day uses about 100 times its weight in ancient plants. Just think of that big, steamy, green pile of stuff. 100 times the weight of your car. That's a lot. And it's very inefficiently converted to gasoline. Where does that fuel energy go when you put it in the tank? Well, 7/8 of it never gets to the wheels. It's lost first in the engine, idling, driveline, and accessories. Of the 1/8 of the fuel energy that does get to the wheels, half of it either heats the tires and road or heats the air that the car is pushing aside, and only the last 6% actually accelerates the car and then heats the brakes when you stop. But only 1/20th of the mass you're accelerating is you. The rest is the heavy steel car. Therefore, only 5% of 6%, or 0.3% of the fuel energy ends up moving the driver. This is not very gratifying after 120 years of devoted engineering effort. But there's good news that 3/4 of the energy it takes to move your car is caused by its weight, and every unit of fuel you save at the wheel saves another 7 units you don't need to waste getting it to the wheels. So there is enormous leverage in making the car radically lighter weight, whether you do it with light metals like aluminum, I drive an aluminum hybrid, or ultralight steels, or advanced composites reinforced with things like carbon fiber. That was our choice when we worked with the industry in 2000 to design a luxury mid-size suburban assault vehicle that can take 5 adults in comfort, up to 69 cubic feet of cargo. It weighs less than half as much as a normal steel SUV that size, but is safer even if they hit each other at high speed. Very brisk performance, and 114 miles a gallon on a fuel cell, or 67 miles a gallon with a Prius-like hybrid powertrain. That gasoline hybrid version would have an extra sticker price of $2,500 in mid-volume production, and that's less than a 2-year payback. The only reason it costs extra is it's a hybrid, not because it's ultralight. That part is free. And part of the reason it's cheap is the way it's made. There's only 14 parts in the body, and they're suspended from rings like an airframe, making it immensely strong and stiff, rather than being built up from a tub, which is the horse and buggy way we build cars. So these 14 parts can each, except maybe the bottom one, be lifted with one hand and no hoist. In fact, the biggest part here on the side I can briefly lift with one finger. Each part is made with one low-pressure die set. A steel body would have 10 or 20 times more parts than this, and each one would have an average of 4 progressive steel stamping die sets. So we just saved about 99% of the tooling cost. These composite parts then snap precisely together for bonding like a kid's toy, eliminating the jigs, robots, and welders to make up the body shop. And we would also perhaps lay color in the mold, and then you can get rid of the paint shop. These are the 2 hardest and costliest parts of making the car, so at least 2/5 of the capital goes away compared to the leanest plant in the industry. And there have been some very interesting recent advances in the manufacturing technique. This is not, as you might expect, a ballistic yarmulke. It's actually a test piece for a military helmet that a little spin-off I used to chair is shipping now. And you can tell from the sound that plastics have changed a bit since the Graduate. This stuff is tougher than titanium. You can actually beat on this as hard as you want with an 8-pound maul and it'll just bounce off. So think of this as this technology for making aerospace-grade composite structures at automotive cost and speed in a scaled, mature process as being kind of like finding a Saudi Arabia under Detroit, because that's how much oil America would save by doing this. My wildcatters have been finding very prospective plays in the Detroit Formation and other Seattle and other places we've been drilling. Basically, if you make cars out of this stuff or light trucks, half the weight and half the fuel use go away. The car gets safer because these materials can absorb about 12 times as much crash energy per pound as steel, and the car costs the same to make. There are also perfectly valid light metal solutions, and the market will sort out which ones win. If you're wondering about safety, just think about the race car world. I want to show you Catherine Legg running into a wall at 180 miles an hour. Watch what's happening back here. Her car is flying to bits, as it's designed
Da wird
to.
natürlich auch Energie abgebaut, ist klar, aber die ist da
She's in that part.
locker. 6. Gang gewesen.
Notice what happens to the big steel fence when that little part hits. So there's a person in there. It doesn't look very promising, but...
And the best news is that Catherine Legg has walked out of the medical center under your own power. How are you feeling?
A bit shaken, but I'm okay, as you can see. Oh, sorry. All my bits are intact, so it's good. It goes to show how strong the cars are.
Where do you have some injuries?
Oh, I just banged my knee. Car upside down, you bang your legs on the bulkhead and on the steering column and stuff, so just a bit of bruising, which won't look too attractive in my dress in the Atlantic banquet tonight. But.
So just remember, that was at 180 miles an hour into a concrete wall, and the energy in the car goes as the square of its speed, and the materials her car is made of have only about half the energy absorption per pound of the ones we would use, and they're a lot more brittle. Now, one of the more interesting, I would even say most exciting developments in this sphere came last October when Toyota showed a hypercar class concept car called the 1X, because with the same volume as a Prius, it uses only half as much fuel and it's a third the weight, made of carbon. There's a little half-liter engine that tucks in under the rear seat, so there's lots of room for people in cargo. And it's a plug-in hybrid that makes it use 20 extra kilos of batteries, take away the 20, you're at 400 kilos, which happens to be what I said in 1991 a good 4-seat carbon car should weigh. It's a much mirth from the industry, as you can imagine. Now, normally people would say, well, that's just a brag. That's what most concept cars are. They never get to market. Except that the previous day, Toray, the world's biggest maker of carbon fiber, happened to announce a $0.3 billion factory in Nagoya to mass-produce carbon fiber auto parts for Toyota and Nissan and others. So taken together, these are a signal of strategic intent. They are definitely not for amusement. And that came in at the start also of a lightweighting revolution, probably using more conventional materials by other companies. Ford announced in the next month that starting to roll out in 2012, they'll be taking 250 to 750 pounds out of every vehicle they make to capture unexpectedly big design synergies. Nissan the next month announced an average 15% weight cut by 2015. China also in December announced an auto lightweighting alliance targeting a 300 kilogram reduction by 2010, which is almost tomorrow in the car business. So things are starting to move fast. I would say lightweighting is now the hottest strategic trend in the industry. Without getting here into all the supply side stuff, which we can do if you like, let me just show you how the moving parts fit together in our off-oil scenario. Instead of needing the officially forecast 28 million barrels a day of petroleum products in 2025, we could make almost 8 of that go away by then through $12 a barrel efficiency and still be saving another 7 in the decade or so thereafter as we complete the turnover of the vehicle fleets. To get the, at that time, 20 million barrels a day, we could get almost 6 from biofuels and the like, almost 2 from no-brainer substitutions of saved natural gas that make sense at any relative price, almost 8 from domestic oil extraction from areas already allowed, and we need to get 5 from someplace else. Where could that be? Well, there's a big menu. Efficiency is so cheap, maybe we should buy even more of it, or wait to get the other half of it that's still in the works at 2025 rather. Or we could continue to import oil from Canada and Mexico, or long before this, WTO will have made our illegal roughly 100% tariff on Brazilian ethanol go away, so we can buy that. Oh, I haven't yet accounted for 2/3 of the saved natural gas, which it turns out would be enough to substitute for this much oil directly, or if you did the most profitable thing with it, you'd make it into hydrogen, which is so much more efficiently usable that you could also displace all the domestic oil that way. We could even become an oil exporter for a while if we wanted. And I'm not counting other options. For example, just the wind power in the Dakotas could by then be cost-effectively making 50 million tons a year of hydrogen, which at these levels of efficiency would be enough to run very competitively every highway vehicle in the country, because vehicles work a whole lot better with hydrogen when you make the tanks in the fuel cell 3 times smaller. Now, big changes have happened quickly before. In the 1920s, it actually took Detroit 6 years to switch from wood to steel auto bodies. In World War II, under wartime urgency, which I'm not assuming but maybe should be, it took Detroit 6 months to switch over completely from making cars to making the stuff that won the war. It was an amazing story. It took 8 years when we last paid attention to oil to achieve the huge savings I described earlier, cutting oil intensity 5% a year, making our cars almost 5% a year more efficient. And actually, of those oil savings in the cars, new domestic cars, 96% came from making them smarter and only 4% from making them smaller. Boeing, as I'll describe presently, has flipped the airframe market with an efficient design in just 5 years. GM's small team took the EV1 battery car from launch to street in 3 years. Generally, if you rely on the normal S-curves of technology diffusion, it takes about 12 to 15 years to go from 10 to 90% adoption in the stock of stuff. However, the policy slate that we suggested in our book would accelerate the takeoff point by about 3 years and then make the adoption much steeper. A lot of this will happen not through public policy, though, but through a breakthrough competitive strategy based on leapfrogs in efficiency, based on advanced manufacturing and design integration, new ultralight materials, and advanced propulsion. So let my example come from Boeing, which, you know, we often forget this, but a decade ago, Boeing was in as deep trouble as Detroit is now. They made wrenching changes to cut cost, for example, Toyota production system. But what about innovation? There wasn't much in the pipeline. There was a Sonic Cruiser, which quickly died of oil prices, and Airbus was pulling ahead, and some folks were starting to doubt Boeing's staying power. Well, their bold riposte, now called the Dreamliner, was a plane that would save 1/5 of the fuel but cost the same, made half of carbon fiber composites by mass, up from 9%, many advantages to both the passengers and the maker, and it has been the fastest order takeoff of any jet in history. It sold out well into 2016, and now they're rolling out that radical suite of advances to every plane they make before Airbus can even steer itself out of the ditch. So it went from Boeing on the ropes to Boeing way ahead in just a few years. Now, in my little 83-person outfit, we're busy implementing the oil endgame strategy through what we call institutional acupuncture. That means we figure out where the business logic is congested and not flowing properly and find the right points to stick needles into to get it flowing. So we need really to change the behavior of 6 sectors: cars, trucks, planes, fuels, finance, and military. And 3 of them, I'd say, are already past the tipping point. In aviation, clearly. In heavy trucks, where based on our analysis, Walmart is requiring doubled efficiency 18-wheelers from its suppliers. They've stepped up magnificently. And then everybody will be able to buy those trucks This will save Walmart billions of dollars, so they're highly motivated, and we're using their demand pull to drag these trucks in the market, and when everybody buys them, they'll save 6% of our oil, which is over 3 times what the Pentagon uses for everything. And then we'll go on to tripled efficiency trucks, which happen to have a 60% internal rate of return. The Pentagon has emerged as the federal leader in getting the nation off oil. If you doubt that, go to the website for the Defense Science Board and look for the new report posted 13 February called More Fight, Less Fuel. The reason this is of particular interest is that as military science and technology turn to things like the advanced materials and manufacturing and propulsion, they will give us the kind of leap ahead in civilian cars, trucks, and planes that we already got when military R&D created little things like the internet, the global positioning system, the jet engine industry, the microchip industry. And this will enable the military to accelerate the transition of the civilian economy off oil, and then we get neg emissions in the Persian Gulf, mission unnecessary, and the warfighters really like that idea. There is a lot going on in fuels and finance. Private capitalists put $117 billion into the global clean energy space last year. But we always knew the toughest, slowest sector to flip would be the light vehicles, but that's changing. We suggested in our book that Detroit should do what Boeing had done. And by golly, Ford went out and recruited the head of Boeing Commercial Airplanes to run Ford. So he's now into Dearborn with transformational intent. The UAW and the dealers are very keen for this kind of basic innovation to save their industry. And what Schumpeter called a tsunami of creative destruction sweeping over Detroit is opening minds to unthinkable change. 2 of the big 3 now are run by guys who are not out of the car business. And then there are leapfrogs like the Tata Nano coming at us. We ran 2 transformational projects with the industry last year, one with a major automaker, another that turned into a spin-off in January with some tier 1s. And also we've gotten the industry very interested in fee-baits, which are a very powerful and attractive way to get efficient cars on the market faster, and this turns out to be a much better deal than either gasoline taxes or CAFE standards. So competition of a kind and intensity we haven't seen since the 1920s is going to change the automakers, managers, or their minds, whichever comes first. And what this does for global oil looks like this. If you take, say, BP data and look at how many trillion barrels you can get out of the ground at what free market price, not counting any monopoly rent OPEC extracts, you find that beyond the trillion barrels we've already taken out and the trillion claimed to be in the OPEC Middle East, things get rapidly more expensive and nasty. But if you conservatively scale to the world, the innovations we described in winning the oil endgame, then everything slides 3 trillion barrels to the right. And since the stuff you're displacing at the upper right corner is peculiarly carbon intensive, you end up saving over 1 trillion tons of carbon, and you also save tens of trillions of dollars free market cost plus whatever rent OPEC would have extracted from us. You'll notice I have not mentioned peak oil. That's because nobody can know who's right about it. 94% of the reserves are held not by auditable companies, but by governments which either don't know or won't honestly tell you what they've got. But it doesn't matter who's right, because we ought to do the same things anyway for other reasons like saving money or becoming more secure or protecting the climate. I have plenty of reasons to want to get off oil without needing to worry about an indeterminate one in addition. So I think that's a bit of a distraction. Let me then briefly tell the electricity story. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, we looked at about 1,000 technologies for wringing more work out of our electricity and found that if you put them in wherever they would make sense and make money, you could save about 3/4 of the electricity then used in the U.S. at an average cost of about 1 cent a kilowatt hour in today's dollars. There were similar findings in more efficient European countries. The utilities think tank found a somewhat smaller and costlier but still very big and cheap potential, and as they'll be the first to tell you, the efficiency technologies have since been improving faster than we use them up. So the low-hanging fruit keeps mushing up around the ankles and spilling in over the tops of our waders while the innovation tree keeps dumping more fruit on our heads. But that's without even counting an advance that's not about technology, it's about integrative design. For example, if you were to come visit where I live at 7,100 feet in the Rockies, you'd find that we can get frost there any day of the year. It can go down to minus 47F, at least it used to. We can get 39 days of continuous midwinter cloud, but if you come in out of the snowstorm to the central atrium, there you are in the jungle where I've harvested 28 banana crops, and then you realize there's no furnace because I didn't need one, and it was cheaper up front not to put one in because the heating system would have cost more to install than it took to get rid of it by putting in more insulation and better windows and stuff instead. So I took the saved $1,100 of construction cost plus another $1.50 a square foot and used it to save also 99% of the water heating energy, 90% of the household electricity, for which I would pay $5 a month if I didn't make it with solar, and half the water, and all that paid back in 10 months with 1983 technology. Now we can do a lot better. Or in a hot climate, up to 115. An ordinary-looking tract house with the obligatory stupid dark roof, comfortable with no air conditioning, costing in volume less than normal to build, saving about 90% of normal U.S. energy use. Or in steamy Bangkok, a house using 1/10 the normal air conditioning energy to keep you more comfortable at exactly normal construction cost. Well, these houses sort of span the range of the Earth's climates, and they have a common lesson that if you optimize the house as a system, you end up with really big, cheap savings, which always surprises the economists because they think of diminishing returns, that the more you save, the more and more steeply the cost of the next unit of savings goes up till it gets too expensive and you have to stop. Well, some components like insulation work that way. Some others, like motors, don't. But if I put in so much insulation, I no longer need a heating system. Guess what? I save the whole capital cost of the furnace, ducts, fans, pipes, pumps, wires, controls, fuel supply arrangements, so I end up saving 99% of the heating energy at a lower cost than if I set out to save little or nothing. I'm getting expanding, not diminishing returns. And why should I get there the long way around when I can tunnel through the cost barrier directly to that destination? Well, we've now demonstrated that behavior in over $30 billion worth of projects in 29 sectors of the economy, including most of the heavy industries. And if you want to know how, go to rmi.org/Stanford, where it's all laid out. In 5 public lectures I did last year in the engineering school, condensing 30 years to 7 hours. And we do a lot of this stuff in industry. For example, consider pumps. Pumps and fans use half the world's motor energy, and motors are most of the electricity. Imagine a pumping loop to move some stuff around in a factory for heat transfer. Well, we ended up cutting the pumping power by 92% at lower cost with better performance just by using fat, short, straight pipes instead of skinny, long, crooked pipes. It's not rocket science. This is good Victorian engineering rediscovered. And then we found we left a factor 4 on the table. Sorry, we'll do better next time. And this is archetypical of what we find in industry and in buildings and in vehicles. So there's one more technology surprise. It's a shock happening on the supply side of electricity. These graphs show, with real data to the left and industry projections to the right of the vertical line, the electricity produced in the world and the capacity installed in the world for what The Economist magazine calls micropower. Micropower is mostly cogeneration, that is making electricity and useful heat together in factories or buildings, which saves most of the money and most of the carbon. It's mostly gas-fired. And then the colored wedges underneath that are renewables other than big hydro. Well, surprise. In 2006, micropower added 6 times as much electricity supply and 30 to 40 odd times as much generating capacity as nuclear power added in the world. That's the black line. Micropower now makes 1/6 of the world's total electricity, 1/3 of the new electricity, and in a dozen industrial countries it makes anywhere from 1/6 to over half of all electricity. This is not a fringe activity. In fact, it doesn't even, thank you, Mr. Gates. it doesn't even count negawatts, electricity saved by using it more efficiently or more timely. And negawatts appear to be about as big as micropower, although not as well measured. So if you add up negawatts and micropower together, they probably provide upwards of half the world's new electrical services, while central stations, which are supposedly indispensable, have less than half market share. That's all the nuclear and coal and a few oil-fired and gas-fired and big hydro plants put together are now under 50% market share in the world for electrical services. In fact, just in this country, the last 5 years, we've put in less new coal capacity than we put in wind capacity last year alone. Why is this happening? Well, micropower is winning because it costs less and has lower financial risks, so it attracts private capital, while nuclear is only bought by central planners. So in 2006, latest data we have, nuclear added less capacity, physical capacity, than photovoltaics added, a tenth what wind power added. These are worldwide numbers. Now, then they lost more than that in retirements, but then they uprated old plants, so they had a small net gain in nuclear capacity. Micropower, meanwhile, added 30 to 40 odd times that much. Micropower passed nuclear in total electric output. Just distributed renewables got $56 billion of private risk capital that year, while nuclear, as usual, got zero. You hear a lot about China's ambitious nuclear program. You might not hear that they have already 7 times that much capacity in distributed renewables, and they're growing it 7 times faster. Just last year, nuclear added less world capacity than China or Spain or the US added wind power. What part of this story does anyone who take markets seriously not understand? And then you look at relative costs. I won't go into this, but basically what it shows is that the cost of making or saving a kilowatt hour at your meter from doing something new ranges from extremely high for nuclear to fairly high for coal and gas plants to less for cogeneration in industry or buildings, especially if you recover heat you're now throwing away, and even less for saving electricity. Well, turn those around. This is cost in cents per kilowatt hour. Now look at cost effectiveness, which is kilowatt hours per dollar. And you find, once you correct for the little carbon emissions by fossil-fueled cogen, that nuclear is almost the least cost-effective way. Only combined cycle gas with very expensive gas is worse, for saving carbon per dollar. Cogen saves more, wind saves more. Efficiency, the average price is around 2 cents, and a lot of it's less than 1 cent, a lot of it's negative cost, so it's way off the chart, saves most of all. In other words, you save about 1.5 to 11 plus times more carbon per dollar buying micropower and negawatts than buying nuclear. So the way the numbers work out, if I spent $1 on a new nuclear plant rather than on efficiency, I'm putting more carbon into the air by that mistaken choice than I would have if I'd spent the $1 to buy a new coal plant. So if any of you think nuclear is a good idea for climate, just remember, if climate's a problem, we need the most solution per dollar and the most solution per year. And if we don't do that, we're making things worse. Now, of course, there's always a possibility that you won't. Sir, you may have been misinformed as to my speaking time. Yeah, okay. Yes, I will. There's always a risk you won't get what you wanted. You might get a dry hole no matter what you buy. But California did an interesting experiment letting all ways to make or save electricity compete for a few years back in the 80s. And in those few years, the utilities bought or were firmly offered savings and new decentralized supply, mainly renewable, that added up to 143% of the state's total peak load. And they had to cut it off because if the bidding had gone on for one more year, it would have displaced every fossil and nuclear unit in the state as superfluous, which, you know, in hindsight might not have been such a bad idea. So, and that was with 25-year-old technology. Today is a lot more powerful and a lot cheaper. And these are extremely large resources. If you add up just efficiency And industrial cogen and wind, you've got 13 to 15 times nuclear's current market share in the United States, which is a fifth of our electricity, not counting other renewables that are even bigger. And it turns out that the reliability issue is a non-issue. Hundreds of studies and a lot of practical experience now show this. If you properly combine, forecast, and integrate the variable renewables, sun and wind, which don't always work, neither does anything else, it turns out that to keep the lights on with the same reliability needs less backup and storage than we have already bought and built to cope with the intermittence of big thermal power plants. We don't need to buy it again. So I think the market collapse of nuclear power, there is no renaissance going on, it's a sham, is very good for both climate and security. It's good for climate because by buying micropower negawatts instead, as the market's doing tens of times faster than nuclear, you get more climate protection per dollar and you get it a great deal faster. Also, you can free up money and attention for better development alternatives because there are orders of magnitude savings in capital from buying negawatts instead of megawatts. So the power sector, now gobbling a quarter of development capital in the world, can be turned around into a net exporter of capital to fund other global development needs. And most important for our security, recognizing the failure of nuclear would actually inhibit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. If my foreign affairs paper in 1980 had been done at the time, implemented, we would not now be worrying about Iran and North Korea. It's a very simple argument. The biggest driver for the spread of bombs is that we're spreading do-it-yourself bomb kits in the form of huge commercial flows of nuclear materials, equipment, skills, knowledge, facilities. But if we stop doing that, which only happens because of subsidy and promotion by governments, then getting these ingredients would be harder, more conspicuous, and politically much costlier when you're caught, because there'd be no doubt what you were up to is making bombs, not electricity. You couldn't claim like Iran, you're just making electricity, not bombs. Well, this wouldn't make proliferation impossible, but it would make it a great deal harder, and we'd be more likely to get timely warning because we could focus our intel resources on needles, not haystacks. So I think the best route to a richer, fairer, cooler, safer world is just to let all ways to save or produce energy compete fairly at honest prices, no matter which kind they are, what technology they use, where they are, how big they are, or who owns them. That's pretty much the opposite of the federal policy we have now, but let's see who's not in favor of that. And if those people claim to be economic conservatives, I think they'll be outed for what they really are, which is corporate socialists. So let me end with this thought. The biggest threat to our energy security is our federal energy policy. It perpetuates and even expands our oil dependence. The Iranian treasury was about broke. We thoughtfully bailed them out. The Saudi treasury was nearly broke. We bailed them out too. Ahmadinejad, Chavez, and Putin, these are, in a sense, our own creation. We pay for them. We fund both sides of the war. We've never done that before. Lose a lot of moral stature in the process. As Secretary Rice says, we're warping our foreign policy through our oil dependence. And a lot of attitudes about us and making our economy less competitive and more fragile. Meanwhile, our policy strongly favors over-centralized architecture of the energy system. I wrote in a Pentagon study in 1981 that a handful of people could turn off 3/4 of the oil and gas to the eastern states in one evening without leaving Louisiana. Sorry if Katrina read that. Building more and bigger power plants and power lines, which is our policy about regional blackouts, makes regional blackouts more frequent and more widespread. It's the same as suppressing forest fires. We're creating fat new terrorist targets near our cities. The centerpiece of our federal energy policy is still to create a new all-American Strait of Hormuz choke point on the north slope of Alaska. Well, thank you, one was enough. And since the President correctly identifies the spread of nuclear weapons as the gravest threat to our security, it's very puzzling that he's encouraging it every way he can think of. I was speaking last night to a military audience and told them if these are not the national security outcomes you want, it's your duty as military professionals to say so. And many of them are starting to say so, thank God. Now, oh, I do have one more, I'm sorry. I hear often 5 myths about implementation. One is, none of this is happening, why not? Well, how many of you knew that in 2006, our energy intensity went down 4% and our economy grew 3%, so our total use of energy and coal and oil went down? Who knew that? Nobody noticed. Our electricity use went up 0.1%. And imagine what would happen if we paid attention and busted barriers. We're told that we can't have solutions without a global agreement. Well, China did not make energy efficiency her top strategic priority for national development because of a treaty, but rather because folks like Wang Jiabao understand that China can't develop otherwise. We're told that pricing carbon is the essential first step. Well, I'm all in favor of it. We should do it. It's valid. It'll be helpful. It's not essential, though. You can make lots of money on efficiency at the old pre-carbon prices before we had the $150 a ton carbon tax that we imposed on ourselves right now, but we pay it to OPEC. Carbon pricing is not sufficient. If you don't bust the barriers, you can get the prices right till the cows come home and not much will happen. And the price effect will not in the long run, I think, be very big because there's all that cheap efficiency out there. Ability to respond to price is even more important than getting the price right, and we need both. We're told that public policy is all about taxes, subsidies, and mandates. That's a really impoverished old agenda. There's a whole lot of other ways to do it, like car fee baits and utility decoupling and shared savings that work better, they're more politically attractive, especially across the aisle. And we're told that public policy is the only key to this lock, or the strongest one. I don't believe it. I think the most dynamic force we've got is innovation in competitive strategy, technology, and design, all from business in its coevolution with civil society. So those of you who are policy wonks, please look at what can be done by those two other poles in our society that move a lot faster and are not gridlocked and are generally outside the beltway. That's where I've spent the last 30 years because I like to do stuff that works. What does all this take? What are we waiting for? We're the people we've been waiting for. And if anything I've said to you seems too good to be true, just remember that nice Marshall McLuhan remark that only puny secrets need protection. Big discoveries are protected by public incredulity. It's your move. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amory.